Hey guys, welcome to episode 2 of the Property Letting Playbook. We're here with me, Andy. I'm the head of marketing at Oasis Living. We've got Sam, who is the founder of Oasis Living, and we've got John Kerr, who's your partner in property. Nice to be with you, John.
Nice to be here.
Thank you, John.
So, John, we brought you in today. Thank you so much for joining us. We just want to get a bit of a feel about, your past experience in property, and we'll just go from there and keep it conversational. So if you just want to tell us about yourself.
Yeah, well, I've done a number of things in my life, but mainly it's been job-wise. I've always been interested in property and sort of dabbled in it for 25 years. But in 2006, 2007, I went to a property meeting and realized that there was no limit to the number of mortgages you could get if you could tick the right boxes and get them. And that might even replace my chief executive salary running a group of lawyers in London if I did my deals correctly. So between 2008 and 2010, I sort of bought a portfolio of properties from Maidstone in Kent, right up to across the central belt of Scotland. And that's been quite diverse, and I've learned quite a lot as a result of that and had a lot of different property experiences, one of which has been the thing that I enjoy most, which is what I call self-catering accommodation.
Okay, cool. So, why do you enjoy that the most? What out of all the things that you've been involved in,
That's a very good question. Right, the first thing is chitching, booking comes in and
Sure.
It's money, and that is a motivational thing. I love processing a booking, which I shouldn't be doing, of course, should I? I should be scaling up my business so that I don't. But you know what? It's my property. I'm not looking to go big. But the real reason, or the substantive reason, is that I'm quite into property. I like my properties, and properties tend to deteriorate, and they do deteriorate even under the best of tenants. They can deteriorate really badly under the worst of tenants. And you get them back every so often, and then and it's not your choice. The tenant leaves when they choose, not necessarily when you choose. And then suddenly you've got lack of rent and a bill to refurbish. And also the properties tend not to be up to my standards. So self-catering accommodation, you can continuously improve it and keep it up to a good and high standard. In fact, you have to. And that's what I like. What's the point of owning property that is not in good nick?
No, it's true. I was just thinking, I've just moved into my first. I just bought my first property, and we were in a let property for 5 years, and we were good tenants. But you're right, even under good tenants, you just have general wear and tear that does last out, and you do a hands-on approach to. My landlord was she's self-managed as well, so it was. She came in and painted everything. We're still quite friendly with her, so. I know what you mean when you're saying it. It's even the best of tenants will leave their mark at the end of it.
Yeah. And of course, the good news about self-catering accommodation, there's usually more funds to pay for that.
Yeah.
So when comparing, what's your thoughts on let and managed through an agency, or in the traditional sense of a high street Foxtons agency, not to name drop them or pull them apart from any of the rest, but what's your sense of them, and do you have an experience with them?
Yeah.
What's your thoughts?
Well, the way I was trained to do property was to do as many good deals as possible. And using certain rules about, buy where there's strong rental demand, for example, make sure that you've got the property cash flows positive to meet your strategy. And I could talk about my strategy for that later. And that you hand them over to a letting agent who does the management, the rent collection, and all the repairs for you. And you should therefore all require a bookkeeper, and you go on and do the more deals, etc. And you just have to make decisions, and if something unusual comes up, problem solving. Unfortunately, not all properties lend themselves to that. So I've got some pretty low-grade properties in areas where letting agents don't really do well, because it's housing benefit, low rents. So the £500 a week for a month for a 3-bedroomed house. And so letting agents are not interested, but they do work well once they're made into self-catering accommodation. And that's where letting agents cannot help, because they don't deal in that market. So there is a role for letting agents, as we know. I mean, there are so many of them. There is a role. I don't want to say anything on this podcast that's negative about them. There are agents and agents. Just a little thing. One other thing that used to frustrate me for those properties that were managed by agents, they would never send a copy of the gas safety certificate. You know, I would constantly have to be on red alert to make sure that it had been done. They didn't seem to understand that I was the one who would go to prison if my tenants died as a result of the gas not being properly maintained. And they never, none of them, I'm sure that there are great letting agents that do that. And the answer that they give is, well, many landlords just don't want to be bothered by all that administration. Well, then I think many landlords need to think about whether they want to go to jail or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, what do you think is the reason for that lack of transparency that seems to sort of be quite pervasive in that traditional letting sense, a letting agent sense? What do you think it is? Because to me, that excuse of, well, they don't want to be bothered, that seems more of an excuse than it does an actual reason. So I mean, what do you think the reason is? Is it?
I think I know. We did start up a little business as a letting agency 10 years ago and decided that it wasn't for us. So I've had experience of the software around that time. It's just systems and processes. It's as simple as that. Does this landlord want the gas safety certificate? When's the gas safety certificate due? Is it overdue? Chase up, send it to it's just a tick box processing effort. And I don't think that's in place in many of those offices. Yeah. And it would depend very much on the software that they might use as to whether that operates. And I do not know, but I would be interested in any of your listeners who say, well, I'm very experienced with some letting agent software, and I can assure you that the software we use does in fact prompt the agent to say, should we send this to the landlord? I would be very interested if it does. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm unsure that without working for an agency directly, I'm unsure of the actual systems that they use, but I'm acutely aware of the holes in whatever systems they are, and you know, that's part of the reason that we exist and why Oasis was founded, is because we wanted to solve those holes in the process and give a more transparent view for the landlord to be able to, not even if they don't want to manage the property, they should be able to see that it's being managed.
Yeah. So I'm sure that the big agents, you mentioned a big London agent a moment ago, I have no doubt that they will do that, but I don't know. I tended to go for smaller agents or startups. And therefore, I think probably, well, not startups, but agencies that had been, were small local agencies. And there are quite a lot of new letting agencies starting up. But as a landlord, when I was dealing with it, I want two things from a letting agent. I want my monthly statement to know how much is going to go into my bank account that month. And well, actually, that's about it. But when there are problems,
the checks and all of that,
but when there are problems, like the tenant's not paying the rent, etc., I want to hear from them every week or more, and you don't. You don't, because they feel there's nothing to report. You know, because we've chased the rent and it's not reported, etc. But that's where communication really comes into its own, and that's difficult. That's difficult.
Yeah.
I mean, as it happens, I've got 4 tenants at the moment, and we have a big problem in the property. Communication with them. I mean, they're looking to get rehoused because it's becoming uninhabitable because of a leak from above. Not complicated, and we haven't yet got the insurance to say, you know, what alternative accommodation can we provide? and finding another 4-bedroom flat in central London, within half a mile of SW1,
So how
is
do
not
you
easy.
deal with something of that sort, where there is a leak that's come up from a flat upstairs? If you can explain to us more about the steps you take, or you would take now, or the steps you should have taken, like in terms of insurance, and then.
Okay, well, I'm not going to talk too much about that because it's happening right now. But one of the things that I wish I had done, one of the things I've discovered is that the standard National Residential Landlords Association room tenancy agreement doesn't require me to accommodate them elsewhere. I was quite surprised to read that. So I have no obligation.
What is the requirement then? Or when would the requirement, I
don't have an obligation in the tenancy agreement to rehouse in the event of a fire or a flood. I don't have an obligation, which is quite interesting. I may have some other obligation if the property becomes uninhabitable, but that's more statutory. I don't want to go into that. What I wish I had done, and what I will do from now on, is advise my tenants to take out a contents policy and alternative, which includes alternative accommodation.
Oh, okay.
So I don't know any tenants that take out contents policies, but
yes, I think that's kind of not the case in the UK. When I used to live in France, and I remember in countries like Sweden, etc., and almost all the Scandinavian countries, tenants take out a home or contents insurance straight away. It's kind of a standard thing. And once I stayed in France for a bit and I came to the UK, I realized, well, it's not actually a thing that most tenants don't do. So I think it's just a culture thing to a certain extent.
Yeah, I have a different experience. The last 2 lets that I lived in, it was baked into the contract that I had to have contents insurance.
I don't think you can force them. I was advised by the NRLA you can't force the tenant. But don't forget, there's a difference between a whole house let and a room only let.
Correct.
A whole house let, almost certainly they're going to take contents insurance, I would have thought. But that probably will come with alternative accommodation built into it, I would think, but I don't know. I have contents insurance in this particular property because it's a block policy, and the block is managed by the council. It's a large, and they have a lot of property, as you probably can imagine. And I therefore only do contents, and I've got content. I just happen to have a sum in there for that, which is interesting. But we kind of digress into a little detailed problem that one has at the moment.
Yeah, correct. I think what would be also nice to know, you're very correct. What would be very nice to know, and this is something I've seen John do for a very long time, is how he takes properties and with a myriad of strategies uplifts the rental value he gets from there. And which is what he's known for, which is what I know about him, and he's quite good at it. So any tips or any word of advice you would have for the landlord audience amongst who look at our podcast would be great. So anything you want to share on that front?
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Yeah, that is true. So I think the first thing you need to do is you need to be quite hands-on if you want to get the best from your properties. I style myself as turning sow's ears into silk purses. And I have got a number of properties around the Midlands and in Milton Keynes, but across the Scottish Central Belt, which are low-value houses. They're what we would call council houses. And in Scotland, they would rent for £500 a month for a 3-bedroom house, quite well built. But none of my friends or family would be seen dead living in one. There's a sort of social element to this. I'm a bit more relaxed about that. I mean, you have some no-go areas, obviously, everywhere, and I've been caught by them. But most places are okay. they might not look such. I mean, in Milton Keynes was probably my worst property because it was in a very notorious estate. Anyway, just let me give you a little story about that property. So that was a 3-bedroomed house that I had bought 10 years previously. It had been, and it had been occupied by housing benefit tenants who had successfully trashed it such that it had to be shut for 6 months. Jeez. You know, it was crawling with stuff. It was unlivable. It was horrible. The agent who sourced it sorted that out for me. I eventually dispensed with their services, took it over myself. They had put in they'd repaired it, and I went to look at it. Said, no, I can't let this property. So I put in a new Howden's kitchen and did the place up, and then let it to housing benefit tenants.
Yeah.
And I learned the housing benefit. So I learned to multiple housing benefit tenants. So whereas the rent might be $750 a month, I got $1,200 a month. I didn't really enjoy doing that because I didn't like taking my housing benefit applicants up to the council to process the paperwork. Mm-hmm. You know, it just didn't enjoy doing that. And sometimes the relationship went wrong, and sometimes they were great. I've got just that going in Milton Keynes, another house in Milton Keynes at the moment. Disabled tenant, and she thinks I'm fantastic. So that particular house, I redecorated it after a few years, after doing this, but the tenant left. That was a great tenant. She left the house absolutely immaculate. She was unemployed, and she went off she managed to retrain as a HGV lorry driver. Cool. You know, the big Arctics, and that's what she does at the moment. Anyway, so that was, 4 or 5 years ago. So I took over the house, thought, what am I going to do? Put in some furniture and staged it and decorated it. And then I did nothing because I thought this house wasn't good enough for the market that I was then beginning to focus on, self-catering accommodation. And a friend was in hard times, so he stayed there for a best part of a year or so. Then he moved out. Then I put it on Airbnb, Booking.com, Expedia, and the rest. And in January 2019, that scuzzy house on one of Milton Keynes' most notorious housing estates, probably a worse reputation than the estate deserves, was my best performing property by a long way in January 2020. January 2020. Yeah. So that's really what I do. Now, COVID comes along.
Yeah.
You have to shut all our holiday lets. By law, you have to shut our holiday lets. At least that's what most people thought. But of course, what we knew, because we'd been in the short-term rental accommodation, is there was a demand for what rapidly became known as key workers. But the number of key workers that were working was huge. Most people were key workers. You know, people fixing gas mains, people keeping the roads open. You know, most people were in fact key workers.
Yeah.
I went on open rent, and I put my properties on open rent. So rather than doing a week, 3 nights or a week, I started doing several months. And so instead of getting maybe £100 a night for a property or £80 a night for a property, I might be getting something like 2.5 times the rent.
Yeah.
So in a house in Scotland, instead of 500, maybe 1,200. Plus they would be paying the energy bills or whatever bills I deemed that were going. And I would give them a tenancy agreement to keep it all right. So it'd be a whole different way of doing it. A lot of paperwork on the ins and the outs. So you have to protect the deposit. As you probably know, rentals are quite heavily regulated, whereas short-term rentals, self-catering, furnished holiday lets is what they're called for tax purposes, are not, generally speaking, very much regulated or not similarly regulated at the moment. So that's really what Sam was referring to when So I look to get more out of my properties. And I quite like that because it enables me to stay them myself. That way you get to know them better and you can organize some better repairs while you're there. And B, the cash flow is quite good. You know, I just need to look at the bank account for the various properties to see that, you know, every few days there's a significant sum of money coming in.
Mm-hmm.
That does give you, your bookkeeper, a bit of a problem though, because there's a lot more reconciliation to do. A rent coming in regularly every month, well, that's easy. You don't need to reconcile that. It reconciles itself automatically on your whatever program you use. But all these unusual things need to be manually reconciled.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's fair enough.
Again, I diverse a bit. I deviate a bit. So there you are.
It's good. It's good information. I think I have just maybe a couple of allied questions on that. So I think quite a few members of our audience who will look at the podcast will probably be first-time landlords, or maybe the first time they're going into a buy-to-let, and which is why they look to get some guidance or advice from us and from this podcast. So do you have any key advice you would want to give them, or any key specific parts that if you're a first-time buy-to-let landlord, look into this or look into that, or look into these 4 or 5 things and choose your pathway on the basis of that? So that's kind of the question. That's a question.
Yeah, I would. I've got a number of things. Firstly is understand what the 5 golden rules are about buying property for investment.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to go through those. And read a book on it. You know, I can recommend a book if you want me to.
Recommend a book.
So I would thoroughly recommend that before you do very much, you read Simon Zucchi's book on property called Property Magic. Mm-hmm. It's into the 6th edition, very easy reading, and it teaches you all the things you need to do about buying from motivated vendors, making sure that the cash flow works, etc., etc., etc. So that's the first thing. Mm-hmm. Educate yourself with the correct knowledge to be a property investor. Most people will buy retail from an estate agent and will buy at full market value. And that's fine. But if they've got a real strategy and want to build a property portfolio, they're going to run out of capital at some time, and they're going to find it very difficult to top that up unless they've, you know, got some private capital source or won the lottery, in which case, why would you want to become a landlord? I would ask then. So the most important thing is work out what your strategy is, you know. So I have a simple strategy when it comes to property, and that is that I don't look at a deal that unless it's going to produce £500 a month positive cash flow after all costs, right, including £10 to £15 per month per bedroom into the maintenance sinking fund. Mm-hmm. So don't forget any costs. Don't delude yourself. So that's £500 a month profit, cash flow coming into my account net after all the outgoings and incomings. Mm-hmm. Any capital that I or my fellow investors, not the mortgagor, mm-hmm. Any capital that I or my fellow investors put into the property, I'm looking for a 15% return on investment. Okay. When I started, it used to be 25, but we were buying significantly below market value, and we were able to pay for the deposit in different ways in those days. Yeah. Now you may have to do a remortgage later on to get the higher return on investments. Mm-hmm. And there are people who get infinite return on investments because they don't put any money into a deal. But don't forget, you always have money, stamp duty, legals, fees, as well as yeah. So that would be work out what your strategy is, mm-hmm. because if you don't know what that is, I mean, it's like if you're going on a journey in the United Kingdom, it's easy to go on a journey, but if you don't have a map and a plan, then you're going to get there if you don't know where you want to go to.
Correct.
And I could show you. I mean, that's how I started. So I've got properties all over, as I mentioned earlier, from Maidstone to Glasgow. I don't know that if I had a tight enough strategy that would have been the outcome. I think I would have preferred that not to be the case. Suits my lifestyle, but I don't think it's ideal. And many investors have properties all over the UK because that's the way they bought.
Mhm.
So, and then the third thing, so the first thing is read, learn the 5 golden rules, work out what your strategy is, and make it tight, not just wishy-washy. I want to do rent to rent, which I don't like, but that's not a strategy. That's just a business model.
Yeah.
And then the third thing I would suggest that you learn how to source from motivated vendors. Learn how to help people who want to give you their property or sell you their property because they have an overriding problem that they want to move away from that property.
Okay.
Because you will open your eyes up to a completely different world of opportunity for property investing, residential property investing. And I've got no end of stories of that where when I started, I didn't realize what I was walking into, and I walked away from the deal and I thought, how did I get that deal at that price? Now I know, because behind the scenes, the money was just not important to the vendor.
Mm-hmm.
Or in some cases, in the case of Hackney Council, who took over who'd taken Roy into Kerr, and it was a property that was extremely hard to sell because it was a sheltered accommodation, I was able to buy it. The council were desperate for the capital out of that flat. 1-bedroom flat, and there was nobody else in town at that particular to buy it. And the estate agent was just really, the estate agent was just setting the terms where I bought it at 29% below the surveyor's valuation in London N1. It's possible.
Yeah. Okay, that's really, really helpful. And I should say for the listeners, like anything that John recommends or anything that any of us recommend as far as reading or sites or anything like that, I will put in the description below on YouTube and Spotify and anywhere else that you're listening to this. I will put a link to that Simon Zucci book down there as well, and maybe some links out to the 5 golden rules as well. So you want to find that.
Yeah.
Thanks, John.
So that's the 3 things. Read up about it, educate yourself, learn the basic rules, get a strategy in place. Really not difficult. Not that easy, but it's got to be your strategy and it's got to suit you, and it's got to suit you in the long term. And I mentor people in that regard. And then finally, learn how to source property effectively.
Sounds
Cool.
good. John, it's also probably correct to say you work with landlords. I mean, you don't work with so many of them, but you work with landlords as partnership, as a mentor / advisor in some way. Would you want to say anything about that? Or if someone who's listening to this podcast would want to reach out to you, how they can work with you, stuff like that. So you want to shed light on in that respect?
So I do work with people in a number of different ways. Somebody asked me if they would manage their property for serviced accommodation in Milton Keynes 3 years ago. And I thought that's not something I do, but I do it, and I quite enjoy it. Would I do any more of that? Might do. It just depends. I work with people that I like and get on with, obviously. I have a joint venture operation. Again, the same rules apply. What I'm really looking to do is to work with young people who want, instead of mentoring them, we put together a company and we take advantage of the opportunities that I see, which is probably in the low value places of Britain, where you can buy a 3-bedroom house or maybe even a 2-bedroom house for well under 100,000, and opening those up to, doing them up really nicely internally and then renting them out sort of short term, or doing service to for several months, etc. That is a great way of getting great cash flow and actually having a good quality property. So that would be my ideal, and I mentor people to check to see whether they would be suitable to work with on that basis.
Mhm.
My aim would be to be, so effectively they would get free mentoring and maybe some free investment, but it's all bought within the company. So it would be a long-term joint venture.
Okay. And if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, how would they do that? Like, because I can put this in the link below as well, so they can get in touch if they, any listeners want to click through and get in touch.
Well, as I say to Airbnb guests, or as you know, are not allowed to make contact with you, I put in John Kerr, your partner in property, but nobody ever Googles that. So you just put John Kerr property and you'll find me. Yeah, John at your partner in property is my .co.uk is my email address. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll include that in the description below so that people can get in touch with you if they want. But yeah, that was really helpful, John. It's really interesting. It's nice to talk to you. I know we chatted the other week for a bit, and yeah, it was just to get a little bit more insight into your knowledge and your experience. So just thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you, Andy, and thank you, Sam. Good to talk to you both. Yeah.
Good to talk to you, John, once again. Thank you very much for your time.